Friends from near and far. So great to see you all. Hi, Junior. I see you.
Where's Junior?
All the way in the back. Lots of characters from the story here today.
Well, good evening, everybody. I want to welcome you all to our authors event series here at Brookline Booksmith. Tonight we are featuring Phinney Baskette and her book, How to Begin When Your World is Ending, a spiritual field guide to joy despite everything. It's a conversation with the wonderful Ellen O'Donnell. Before we hear from these brilliant speakers, we request that you keep your mobile phones on silent during the event. And if you have not yet picked up your pre-order, we are going to have them at the back register back there. Also, if you have yet to buy either the wonderful book we're featuring this evening or O'Donnell's other delightful book, Bless This Mess, we have a few copies at the back register as well. I want to thank, of course, Ellen O'Donnell for moderating this event. She is a pediatric psychologist at Mass General for Children. She is a writer, she is a mama, and a person with type 1 diabetes. She is also an instructor on psychiatry at the Harvard Medical School. She specializes in supporting pediatric patients and their families in coping with chronic illness and acute burn injuries. So she is the co-author of the parenting book, Bless This Mess, which she conveniently wrote with our actual author for the evening.
How fun is this?
Amen corner.
So the wonderful Phinney Baskette is here celebrating the book that just hit the shelves. She is a progressive Christian pastor, also a mama, cancer survivor, and doomsday Pollyanna. Outside of tonight's featured title, the previously discussed Bless This Mess, she has written other books such as Real Good Church, Standing Naked Before God, and Remembering My Pet, and Remembering My Grandparent. So we are here to celebrate this book, and I want to pass it over to our wonderful writers, and I hope you have a good evening.
Thank you, Jessica. I asked Jessica if I, and Ellen if I could say just a word before we started. There are some kids in the audience, but I warned their dad there'd be some cuss words. My first shitty job was across the street at a medical billing facility. When I was 15 years old, I used to walk a mile here from Boston Latin School and spend hours every day trying not to fall asleep, trying to alphabetize by hand because everything was analog in those days, all the last names that began with Mick. So this feels like a huge upgrade from that time in Coolidge Corner, and to be in the iconic Brookline Booksmith bookstore talking about a book that many of you helped me create is just peak life moment. So thank you, Brookline Booksmith, and thank you all for being here. Yay.
So welcome everyone. So I've had the honor and the privilege of reading this book more than once, including before it was even in book form. And I can't wait for everyone to get their hands on their own copies and start reading. But so one of the things that I know that I thought might be interesting for everyone else to know would be that this really started as Molly's sort of cancer blog, and then was maybe going to be a cancer memoir, and then as you'll see when you get to read the book, you'll see that it really has expanded into something so much more and so much more universal about struggle and resilience and faith and friends and family and so many things. So I thought I'd start by asking Molly to talk a little bit about why and how the book expanded the way that it did.
You bet. So as you said, Ellen, it started as a blog when I was diagnosed with cancer in 2010. Writing is a way I make sense of the world. If I can't make sense, make meaning in the world, and I just needed to write myself to the surface. So it was purely for me. I broke a lot of the rules of blogging. Wasn't very good at self-promotion, but I think watching this unfold in real time really attracted a lot of people, like sort of popcorn eating, what's going to happen next. And then when cancer was over, I knew I wanted to wrestle it in some kind of book form with a beginning, middle, and end to help people like me who were undergoing treatment or facing survivorship when they were done with treatment. Is really another kind of reckoning moment when there's you're not actively fighting anymore, you're just waiting for some invisible horror to unfold again inside your body. So my first pass was, gosh, I don't know how long ago now, probably 5 or 6, couldn't have been that long ago, because we knew Joy Tootala, our agent for Bless This Mess, and I gave her this thing that I thought was pretty darn good, and she, being a straight shooter, said, "This is a blog dump, I know you can do better." And I was like, ooh. She said, you know, for people who know you or people who, you know, very specifically have cancer, there's something here, but how can you make this for everyone? And so I went back to the drawing board. It took me a while to find the structure, and the cancer, my cancer story is still a through line in it, but it really became much more about how we all survive the very challenging things in life that try to kill us. And some of those things do kill us. You know, not everyone makes it through everything. And I've been blessed and privileged to walk with so many people in my churches and in my life in general who have risen from their own ashes in extraordinary ways, and your stories needed telling. So I put them all together in a way that hopefully makes sense, and here's the result.
I think it definitely makes sense. Another sort of backstory is that when the first jacket cover came out, kind of synopsis, Molly sent it to me and she said, "This feels off, like it's just not quite right." And I think because we sort of share a writer's brain now, I wrote back very quickly and said, it's the tested and transformed. That's not right. And she was like, "Yes, that's right. It's the transformed doesn't make sense," because it really sort of implied a story of, you know, this pastor, this person of faith who was forced to question everything she ever knew, you know, with this cancer diagnosis, and came out with something, a transformed kind of faith, something totally different. And I was like, that's a good story, but that's not a true story. And it's not this story, for sure. So maybe you can talk a little bit about what this story is and what the experience of having cancer, the experience of walking next to people through world-ending times and experiences has actually done for your faith, and what's in the book.
Yeah. In the book I talk about systematic theology. When you go to seminary, most of us have to write what's called a systematic theology. We read a lot of books of theology, and we have to decide sort of what to keep and what to cast away. We have to come up with sort of a holistic understanding of how the world works, and heaven and hell, and just everything, all the pieces and parts. And you know, some of us were in seminary at 22, so to have to like come up with that when you're 22 and you haven't lived all that much is challenging, and inevitably, and then you write an ordination paper if you're getting ordained, and lots of people poke holes in it. And it's a rich process. I almost wish everyone had to do it, to come to terms with what they believe and to challenge their own belief systems. But whether you do that formally or not, life is going to do that for you, right? So cancer didn't so much, it was a winnowing process. You know, Jesus preaches a parable of the wheat and the tares, or the wheat and the weeds, and he says you have to watch them grow up together to figure out which one is which. You don't want to mess with it when it's like tender and growing, because you really can't tell. And I think this is true of life at every stage. Like, we don't know when everything's growing up together what is useful and nourishing and what is, you know, gonna crowd out growth. I don't want to get into binaries of good and bad. But getting cancer was one of those experiences. You know, I say somewhere in the book that part of my theology, you know, my theology got refined, is that not one bad thing has happened to me in my life that I can't, at least in spiritual hindsight, see the good hand of God within. And I think that is a perspective I'm blessed with. I feel like I'm gifted with faith. I do work at it, but I also feel like I just lucked into a lot of it. I feel like in my early life, I had really good mentors, teachers, you know, human and other angels who helped me keep hope through really hard times. And then I just kind of, that hope thing was working for me, so I kept going. So it's just really a process of continual refinement. And another piece of that transformation, you know, when you write, as a working preacher, I've been preaching, I preached my first sermon when I was 13 years old at Broadview Congregational Church in Hartford, Connecticut. Someone saw something in me then. But preaching more full time for almost 30 years, and I tell a lot of stories in my sermons. Telling stories is an act of making meaning and making sense and healing what was broken. And a lot of the stories I tell about people who are sitting in the pews as I'm telling them, so you have to ask their permission, right? One thing that really took me to a whole nother level with this book is, some of the stories I told are from people whose churches I've left, and their sort of boundary issues with how you communicate and encounter. And some of the stories are just so wrenching. This is not too much of a spoiler because it's in one of the earliest chapters, but I tell a story about a woman who had a psychotic break and murdered her daughter, planning to turn the gun on herself because she thought they would both be safer dead. And I tell a story of a man who, in one of my churches, who went to prison for 5 years for pedophilia, for child sexual abuse. And I didn't call them before I wrote the stories. I just wrote because I needed to just write. But then at some point I had to call them and say, hey, can I tell the story of the worst thing that ever happened to you? Not in a sermon on a Sunday that like 200 people are going to listen to, but like an actual book that with any luck might reach more than 200 people. And to my great surprise and joy is the wrong word, gratitude, they both said yes. And I did that for everyone I mentioned with any, sort of muchness in the book. But memory's a funny thing, like even though I journaled about things or had written some of these stories into sermons, people remembered it differently, and where our memories differed, I went with their memory because that seemed the respectful thing to do. If they didn't want their story told, I pulled it. If they wanted anonymized, I did. And, there's no hero of this story. I'm not the hero, they're not the heroes, we're all just people. But it's been such an emotionally complex thing to tell these stories and then take them back to the protagonists and kind of worry them and work on them together. And I noticed in myself, like, this desire to make things come right or to lionize people more than they were willing to be lionized. And it was just a really moving process.
Yeah. And you said you wanted to get away from the binaries of good and bad, and I think you can't do the work that you do or the work that I do every day listening to stories of people's worst moments, and continue to hold a really black and white binary view of the world. You just can't. It doesn't make sense anymore. And I think that you really honor people's stories in holding that middle ground and that gray. And so I can imagine that most of the people you reached out to felt safe with their stories in your hands. But maybe you can talk a little more about that too, because I think in writing, it is sometimes nice to have the climax moment and then everything resolves in the end, and that doesn't work.
We all love Hollywood endings. Let's just admit it. We don't all love rom-coms, but most of us really need that resolution because there's so little of it in real life,
It's
right?
almost Hallmark Christmas movies.
I know. Binge watch.
Love that.
But you really stay away from that, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about that, and it might lead into the reading that you wanted to do for us tonight too.
So one of my rules of thumb when I'm preaching is I test the sermon as I go, and I say, is this true? Is this really true? Is any part of it bullshit? If any part of it is bullshit, I can't say it because people need the truth. Like, they need the truth more than they need to feel temporarily good. And if I feed them something that's obviously untrue, that feels good in the moment, it's not nourishing food, it's not going to serve them, and the God I represent is going to be not believable. Like, not only will they not believe me, they may not believe in God in the same way because God let them down. So it has to be true, and that means it can't be a binary, like here are the good guys and bad guys, here how things resolved, and everyone lived happily ever after. And we live in the gray area, but we live in color as well. Like, it's not just gray nuance, it's black and brown and chartreuse and puce and there's the whole everything. And if there's anything we can count on in life, it's going to keep changing. And if things are really hard and we can just, like, all we can do is get through the next 15 minutes, that's all we have to do. And maybe in some intellectual prefrontal cortex, higher order thinking part of our brain, even if our feelings don't believe it, like, call on that part of the brain to say, it's not always going to suck this much. It's not always going to be this hard. I'm not always going to feel so devastated, and I just have to breathe. That's all I have to do. And call in the right supports. I have people. I have chocolate. I have Hallmark movies. Whatever gets you through. So it's that kaleidoscope. And, some of us really hate that things keep changing. I mean, the last 3 years we've lived through have been freaking exhausting. Amen?
Amen. It sucked.
Sometimes you just want things to be the same for a while. And that's not the way life is. But
Nope, it's messy.
it's messy. But if it's hard, it's going to get better. And if it's good, don't get too attached. Sorry. See, there it is. The whole truth.
Hope today wasn't a really good day.
It was! Damn it!
Running on a high note.
I
Shall I
know.
read from the book? Okay, I gotta find it. So this is actually, I opened right to the page. Thank you, Jesus.
Sin of certainty.
This is from a chapter called The Sin of Certainty. It's a story that takes place at the church I used to serve in Somerville, First Church Somerville in the house, holla! Some of y'all are here. They have a festival called the Drag Gospel Festival every year, and this is something that happened on that day in, I don't remember what year, 2014 maybe, 2013. And I've been talking about anti-queer theology and parents of young people who came to our church who were like not on board with their kids' queerness, and I would try to bring them along. But anyhow, then again, those parents weren't wrong. Occasionally, our sanctuary was transformed into a wild bacchanalia of joy, like at our annual Drag Gospel Festival, a fundraiser for gay and trans refugees from countries like Uganda and Jamaica, where to be queer is a death sentence. Serenity Jones, our drag queen in residence, invited her professional drag friends every year to perform in the overflowing sanctuary to raucous applause, laughter, and tears. Queer and straight, we all delighted in an opportunity to gender bend, whether we were performing or pew sitting. Straight men in church lady hats and smoky eyes, soccer moms with fake mustaches, even the babies were in drag. Our abundant harvest of church children hooted and leaped with joy. We stepped out of the stream of ordinary time and into Kairos, kingdom time. A few minutes into worship one year, I noticed our associate pastor Jeff, a bearded, brawny, and tender-hearted former community organizer who could both weep publicly without shame and face down wealthy, bullying Manhattan restaurateurs with steely resolve, sitting uncharacteristically rigid in his chair, staring out, even as bits of feather boas were flying through the air around him. What could possibly be the matter? I leaned over to him. "What's wrong with you?" I asked. He unobtrusively pointed. "That guy over there," he answered. "Front pew, left side. He's very angry and agitated." I'll put the deacons on notice," I said. "No, it's probably okay. I'll do it anyhow." And I moved easily, smiling, toward the back in my Pope costume. Liz had seated herself next to the angry interloper with willful, joyful 5-year-old Nora. Nora, who had zero shyness with strangers, now climbed over him, trying to get to the exit, shattering his self-imposed isolation. I found Deacon Jeffrey and Deacon Marlin in the back, pointed him out, and asked them to move closer and observe. We saw his lips moving. Was he rehearsing a speech? Was he so spitting mad his brain couldn't contain the words? Was he hearing voices from somewhere else telling him to act? I asked my husband Peter to move in too, feeling physical pain that I was asking my heart to potentially put himself in harm's way. As Jeff started reading scripture, I sat next to our 27-year-old moderator, Ian. I took his hand and asked him to pray with me. That man, he's angry. I'm not sure what he's going to do, I said. Because the week before, 3 mass shootings at college campuses. And the previous summer, Dylan Roof killed 9 people in their own church for being black. And previous to that, the shooting in the Unitarian Church, people killed for being liberal Christians. I held Ian's hand and I prayed to God for protection. I know you didn't protect those people in Charleston, South Carolina, Lord, the people who loved their enemy and talked to him for an hour, humanizing themselves. I know you loved them as much as you love us, and you couldn't or wouldn't protect them, but I'm asking you, please be our shield against hatred and those who would hurt us. I prayed, and Reverend Jeff read this scripture aloud, which I have never before heard in all its splendor. If God is for us, who is against us? The one who did not withhold her own son, but gave him up for all of us, will she not with him also give us everything else? In all these things we are more than conquerors through the one who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus. I felt the air heavy with spiritual power. Magic was present. And then the man stood up slowly, as if summoned by the scripture. He stepped over the front pew into the free space. Turning toward us, he began shouting, "You have painted Christ like a prostitute!" As if in a pre-rehearsed dance, Marlon and Jeffrey and Peter and Dan and Keith and Steve moved in on him, closing the circle. They touched him gently, patting him down, containing him the way you would a toddler who's acting out, keeping him from hurting himself or others while not getting hurt oneself. At least that was the hope, because when they stood up and stepped in, there was no way of knowing if he was armed. These men, these gentle, wonderful men, some of them the fathers of young children themselves, interposed their bodies willingly to protect us. And Reverend Jeff, his face painted to look exactly like the genderqueer 12th century Jesus icon of our photoshopped drag gospel poster, walked down from the chancel and stood about 15 feet away from him. Ablaze with the spirit of a Hebrew prophet, Jeff said loudly to our men, "I want your hands off of him. Get your hands off of him." The man had a name tag on. Perhaps some part of him wanted to be known, and Jeff called him by name. "Drew, Drew, I want you to know that I love Jesus too. I love and honor the person of Jesus down in my soul." I went over to support Jeff, and standing about 10 feet behind him, I held up my hands in blessing, in support, the way you would put your hands up behind someone you're afraid is going to fall. I couldn't let Jeff stand there alone and was worried that Drew might intend us physical harm. Later, I went over the scene in my mind 1,000 times. How grateful I was that I wasn't the one who was on the chancel when Drew started his speech. How grateful I wasn't the one who had to find the words and present my armorless body. Jeff continued. "I want you to look at these people," he directed Drew. "This is the face of some of God's children." Jeff looked. Drew looked. I looked out over the congregation. No one was fleeing, though they had good reason to. The atmosphere was now tense and terrifying. The flying feathers were all on the ground, and the children, instead of running around and climbing over pews, were still. Everyone was sitting alert. Then hands began to go up in blessing. First a few, then dozens, open palms sending peace toward Drew. They had been practicing blessing for so long, Every previous act of blessing, backpacks and babies, offering envelopes and Peace Corps volunteers, low-wage workers getting robbed by their companies, and LGBT asylum seekers had been leading up to this moment, this blessing 2.0, this ninja-level blessing of the enemy while he is in the act of cursing you. Jeff and Drew continued to talk at a distance, Drew spooling out his speech, Jeff answering him in love but with healthy boundaries. Finally, Jeff said, "You've said what you've come to say, you've been heard, now it's time for you to go." "But one other thing," Jeff said, "look at me." Drew looked into that turquoise-shadowed, red lipsticked, genderqueer Jesus face, a mirror of the poster that had brought him to our door that day. And here's what Drew had to listen to that Jesus say directly to him. "I love you." Then Drew, turning to face us, said, "I love you too. I love all of you." Afterwards, someone told me they heard him add, "Please forgive me, but I'm not sure that's true." And with that, Drew left. Keith and Marlon and Peter accompanied him down the side stairs, where he started sobbing. He walked away toward Davis Square. Deacon Erica had called the cops, and they arrived a few minutes later. When he was out of sight, the congregation clapped and cheered, but Jeff stayed the cheering with a raised hand. This was a moment of relief, but not a moment of triumph over another human being. We would not shame him as he left weeping. And then our guest preacher, Reverend Day, a queer, black, lesbian UCCer with Pentecostal sensibilities, got up and preached her heart out. It was all about love. About not just ordinary human love, but God's kind of gonna stay with us no matter what love. And she broke into song, which I won't do right now. Ain't no mountain high enough, and we sang back, ain't no valley low enough. And we all sang, ain't no river wide enough, keep me from getting to you, babe. She preached like nobody's business, and we waved our hands in the air and hollered back, and hollered out our fear and our adrenaline, our courage and our joy. When it was time to take the offering for queer asylum seekers, King Jean-Pierre from Cameroon gave his testimony. He told us how he had been cut and burned, robbed and hounded away from his village, away from his role as a tribal leader, away from family, home, and all his worldly possessions. He told us about almost losing his life. And we caught a momentary taste of what it is to suffer for your beliefs and your identity, and the identity of those you love and stand and pray, sing, dance with. And we gave. We gave $7,500 that day, our scrappy little church, for the lives of queer refugees. The closing song was a meditation called Breathe In, Breathe Out. And that's exactly what we did. We sang it over and over and let the stress hormones leave our bodies. And then we had a dance party, because sometimes that's just what God's people need.
Do you want to share with us what you learned about Drew later?
So when I was vetting the text, the manuscript through the people in the story, I sent it to Jeff Mansfield, my colleague Jeff, and he said, "Hey, do you know what happened to Drew later?" And I said, "No, what?" Like, I think, the story I wrote in my mind, the way I wanted the story to end was like Drew came out, right? And found a church like ours and was able to be embraced and loved for who he really was. And this is why it's real life. Jeff had put a Google alert on anything that came up on Drew because he was scared that Drew was going to come after him. Drew had posted things online about us, and other people were posting like bomb threats and death threats, like nothing too serious, but still very scary at the time. Then things quieted down. But this is now, years later, because it was when was Charlottesville? 2015, okay. 2017. Yeah, because I was in Berkeley already. Drew showed up at the Unite the Right rally with his friends, the white supremacists, and he was wearing a college sweatshirt and was mistakenly, there was a case of mistaken identity. He was taken for an adjunct professor at that college. That adjunct professor then got doxxed by, lefties. His information posted online, and he got threats. And Richard Spencer, former, reformed, whatever, white supremacist, I don't believe it. I do believe in people reforming, I'm not sure about Richard Spencer. Took this as his cause célèbre, like, see, this is what Antifa does, the left is violent, and blah, 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 and made it a national story. And something like 2 or 3 weeks later, Drew was found dead in his home. And we don't know why, we don't know if it was suicide or an overdose or something else entirely. So that's just, like real life, and we have choices in life, and we are given grace and opportunity to do better, and not all of us take them or are able to take them. So
We don't get to write the end.
we don't get to write the end, or we can write the end, but it may not satisfy.
May not be true.
May not be true, yeah, or it might be true and just sad, just plain old sad.
Yeah. Do you want to talk at all about how, in that example, but I think in many examples, especially as we're talking about over the past couple of years, I think people want easy answers. They want to feel in control when everything feels
Yeah.
like it's spinning out of control.
Yep.
And we get sort of pushed into our corners to
Yeah.
hold up our gloves and defend our positions and move further in one direction or another. And I think you've felt that too, some pressure to do
Yeah.
that.
Well, yeah, I live in Berkeley, California. I thought I was a lefty till I moved to Berkeley, California. It turns out I had a lot more to learn. Fundamentalisms are very attractive because they give us really tidy ways of structuring the world and understanding who is good and who is bad, and where obviously there's a lot of fundamentalism, rising to the surface on the right, no longer ashamed to speak transphobia, racism, misogyny, all the other isms, in all the public platforms. The lefties have their fundamentalisms too, we also want refuge. Because we're scared. I mean, that's what's at the root of it. We're scared of losing power. We're scared of losing our lives. We don't understand where this world is flying to at, perilous speeds. We don't see the future. And I have a new kind of metaphor brewing. I have my days. I call myself a doomsday Pollyanna because I definitely get scared and have my moments where I'm like, is this it? Like, we're all going out in a blaze of glory. Let's eat, drink, and be merry because after the midterms, who the hell knows? And I love, is it Valerie Kaur who says, it's not the darkness of the tomb, it's the darkness of the womb.
Yeah.
And so I have this idea that we're actually in the 4th trimester right now, right? Like what we think of as the world coming to an end and going off the rails and completely falling apart in a like blaze of Elon Muskery and Vladimir Putinery and Trumpery is actually like we are being sent home with this very tender, fragile thing that we have, like, we feel zero confidence that we can care for. And whether the it is this country or democracy or like just the insanity of, QAnon or the earth itself, which is, in trouble. We know more than we think we do. We have supports and friends. It's all it does is like eat, sleep, and poop and cry, and we're like, ah, and we like in our darkest moments we're like, I don't love you, right? We're like, ew, get away from me.
You're sucking the life out of me.
Exactly, you're sucking the life out of me, Earth, planet Earth, or American democracy, or whatever it is. But if we can just remember to breathe, sleep when the baby sleeps, all the stuff they tell new parents. we will gradually fall in love with this creature. It will almost certainly happen unless we have postpartum depression and we need more support. You know, there's medication for that, there's therapists for that, there's lots of ways. So, you know, there's something much more hopeful about thinking of this as like the totally terrifying but very possible time of fourth trimester. You know, that coming home with a newborn. So it's my Pollyanna line and I'm sticking with it.
I like it.
Thanks.
It'll preach.
There you go.
Well, and I think knowing you, reading the book, all of it, that was probably one of the hardest lessons for you of cancer was giving up some control.
Oh yeah.
In lots of ways, professionally, personally, all of it, completely, over your body, over your parenting to some extent, and that line between being in control and being in power, or being in control and trying to control everything, it's slippery. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that too. Learning to, I mean, I think you did talk about it, and part of giving up control is just focusing on the next 15 minutes and not trying to write the ending for anybody.
Yeah, I mean, cancer was really a game changer for me. You know, writing this, I sort of did some reverse engineering on my own sort of personality and soul and how I became, you know, the adult Molly, and a lot of it I think was about you know, I was gonna like work my way, like 15 years old, filing all those mix, you know, across the street. I was gonna work my butt off. I was gonna make enough money that I wouldn't be poor, because I grew up poor with one family, working class on the other side of the family, and I knew I wanted more, and I did not want to feel that insecurity and vulnerability all the time. And then, so strength kind of became my brand, and it was really clear to me the chemo was going to kick my ass, and I was not going to be able to keep working, and I was not, and I wanted to go to church, because like you need church at a time like that, and I really commend my congregation then for being able to hold that, to receive frail Molly and not ask me for anything, and offer the right kind of things. You know, like the people who were, because they've been there themselves, able to drive me home from chemo and not like worry about awkward silences in the car. And so there was so much learning for me then, and I know, at least for myself, this is very true, that God needs to get me, like, I'm most receptive in those really vulnerable moments to growth and to change patterns and break patterns. So like, not cured of my workaholism, but it got interrupted. I got to look at it from a lot of different angles, and there was a big aha moment in my parenting during that time too. You know, I talked about, you know, writing my way to sort of meaning and healing. And I talk a lot about, I have two kids, Carmen's 16 and Rafe is 20 now, and they're very different. They're both wonderful kids, but like so opposites. And Carmen's very like petite and sensitive and joyful until she sees a lost dog sign, and then it's like the veil of tears. And Rafe is like a tough guy. He was always big for his age. He was like, except for when, like, he was tough and tender, and he was bullied in early elementary, and that made him even tougher, and it made it hard to kind of see his tenderness. So like, he came at life, you know, like fists up in a lot of ways, and that made our way of parenting him more combative than it could have been or needed to be. And I was like really sick in the hammock at my friend's house one day. This story's in the book, and God's like, you know, you think this is a phase that he's going to outgrow, but what if he doesn't? Like, he thinks you and Peter don't love him and don't like him, and what are you going to do about that, basically? And I'm not going to say it got all better right after that, but it was the seed in the soil that grew and grew, and we had a very turbulent next 10 years, I would say. But we so clearly loved each other so much, all four of us in our family. And there's a lot of stories about both the kids, and I feel very grateful that as a preacher, I have two kids who, you know, more or less like being preachers' kids and let me tell their stories. You know, and they read all the parts about them before we went to press and approved them. And actually, he's 20 now, he was 19 when I submitted the final manuscript, and I learned so much about him the night that we went over those parts, and he learned so much about himself. So it's just, our parenting book is all about our kids are not raw material to be molded. They come as themselves, and then they keep becoming, and your whole job as a parent is just to get to know your unique and wonderful kid. Keep rails up so they don't go too far off the rails, but not try to make them something they're not. And Rafe has been my best spiritual teacher in that regard.
Yeah.
So
Not to commit the sin of certainty of you
Yep.
knowing what's best for
Yeah.
them or anybody, or
Right.
even for yourself,
yeah,
right? To know what's best for yourself.
yeah, absolutely. And to know that we are all becoming, and we can keep changing. Peter and I found a very good therapist for Rafe, who he wasn't interested in seeing at the time at one of our sort of naders. And Peter and I ended up going for parent coaching, and it helped our marriage, and it
told you to do that.
helped our.
Oh my God.
Ellen was like, you can call me anytime, and I won't charge you, but I think you really need.
No, I think it was you said he doesn't want to go, and I said, but
Oh.
you guys should go.
Yeah, you said that. Yeah.
Even if he doesn't want to go,
Yeah.
you should go.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and that was, we had some real breakthroughs because of that relationship. Yeah.
Well, and it's whenever these things happen that are out of our control, when the world feels like it's ending or totally overwhelming, we want to try and control everybody else, but
Yeah.
really all we can do is work on ourselves.
That's right.
That's the only thing we actually have
That'll
control
preach.
over.
That'll preach.
There's a lot of talk about resilience.
Mm-hmm.
I bet, I don't know, pretty soon it's going to be like in the bookstore, I think. The self-help section is going to be right next to the resilience section.
Right.
Yeah.
We all
It's
need
like
it.
the trendy word. I'm supposed to put that in everything I publish or write or do.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
The
We're all
keyword
like so
search.
tired of it.
Yes, I know.
But I think I was
You
telling you
still
the
need to
other
do
day that I was listening to a podcast with Esther Perel
Oh, I listen to too.
with a couple from Ukraine, where one half the couple is still in Ukraine and the other is in Europe, and the long story short was that she was sort of giving them some instructions on coping because their world could end at any moment. They're still in the middle of the trauma, of the scary. And I think, that's probably one of the biggest challenges of going through cancer is you can't get out of it to a safe space anytime soon, necessarily. And so she was kind of advising them on what they could be doing. And my words for it, what I came away with was, she said, I was trying to draw on something I could give them. I've never lived through a war. And she said, so I drew on what I had learned from my parents and their friends, all of whom had spent years in concentration camps, about the different ways that they coped. And she ended up advising them to have their serious conversations, but also have some date nights and like dance on Skype. And what I took away from it was that if we're going to get through any hard time, big or small, that we need both reverent and irreverent ways of coping. And then I thought immediately, yeah, that's Molly. And so the book, even though this part was, I saw people tearing up as they should, but there's also a lot of really funny shit in this book. So, do you want to talk a little bit about that, about the irreverent ways of coping and the humor?
Yeah. So, what we don't want is right-siding everything. What we don't want is toxic positivity, because that's bullshit, amen?
Amen.
But it doesn't mean we don't laugh when the chips are down, or like cultivate our, gallows humor, or behave in paradoxical ways, because it's just what our bodies and spirits like most need in the moment. The last chapter of the book is called Dance When You're Broken Open. It's sort of like a sizzle reel of like dance parties from hard times and good times in my life. I was on a podcast recently about vital and thriving congregations, pastors in the crowd, like we're all panicking over, will people come back, and how do you do church post-pandemic, and is the party over of mainline church? And I don't really know, but what I know, they said, how do you know a church is thriving? And I said, we're all obsessing about numbers, and it's, my sanctuary seats 600 people. So when there's like 80 people there on a Sunday, it feels yucky. It feels empty and terrible, even if the people who are there really want to be there. But ultimately, I know it's really not about numbers. It's about the spirit of the place. And I said, I know it's thriving if there are three things. If there's laughter, tears, and transformation. If those things are happening, we're real, we're alive, the Spirit's moving in us, we're moving the right stuff out of us and into us. So, to me, that's what it comes down to: laughter, tears, and transformation.
All of which you will definitely find
In this book, for only $26.99.
We didn't even script that part.
Nailed it.
That was totally ad-libbed. It's 7:45, so do you want to ask if anyone has any questions?
Yeah.
Questions, comments, thoughts?
Michael.
Okay. Yeah, so I was thinking, I want to ask this question, but I don't want to sound spiritually negative. Okay.
It's fine, bring it.
So, as a pastor, do you hear kind of a lot of what you said about your cancer, like these people like yourself who really work hard at being great people, work hard at spreading love and God's word everywhere you go, and then get hit with the worst possible thing?
Yeah.
Do you, or maybe some of the people you talk to, go, wow, you know what? Is all this praying I do a lot of BS because I'm doing all of the right things, and look at all the wrong things happening? Like, how do you reckon that with yourself and with some of the people that you talk to in your parish?
I'll repeat the question just in case people didn't hear. So it's essentially, as a pastor, when you have people who are really working hard on their faith, on themselves, and they're praying, and they are, I took even from that, humble about things, and then terrible, really difficult, hard stuff still happens. And so how do you make sense of that? How do you help other people make sense of that? Essentially, that why do bad things happen to good people?
Yeah. Thank you. So how do I want to enter that? God never promised you a rose garden. Sorry, that's super cheesy, but bad things happen in life, and there's zero correlation to how good you are and whether or not bad things are going to happen to you. Like, let's just get rid of that right away. That is really simplistic bullshit. And we know just from using all of our senses that that's not the way the world works. There's two little bits of theology that I want to share with you that really help me in times like this. One is from a book called The Solace of Leaving Early by Haven Kimmel. She's a seminary grad. She essentially digests this concept called process theology, which is like God is with us in all the things, but God is not controlling all the things. And she describes God as lore. God can't make us or prevent things, but God is a force, sort of a magnetic force at the heart of creation. And in those moments when we're suffering and struggling, we can pray, we can make conscious contact with the divine on behalf of ourselves or someone we love. And it's going to help eventually. It may not cure our friend or cure our cancer, like my friend Carrie's here. We said bye to a deeply beloved young person who had the same cancer I did while I was in treatment. It sucked. She was such a bright light, and she had been through so much, and she died, and it was not fair. It was so wrong. But I didn't feel like God favored me in not forgetting her name because I'm blanking. KG. It's just the way life works. Sometimes cells divide and they keep dividing, and the medicine's not enough. So God is present with us. We can get quiet and see where God is luring us. And the other piece is from Judaism. It's Tzimtzum, is this concept of God shrinking themselves up to make room for free will. So not all the bad things that happen are, like tsunamis and cancer. You can't avoid those things. But you can avoid the terrible things humans do to each other, right? We should be able to avoid more of that. But God gave us free will, and so that introduces a whole nother line of hard things that happen to us. Because God is ultimately a creator who is a co-creator and gave us the freedom to screw up, and we keep giving each other the freedom to screw up and then make amends, come to terms, apologize, restore, engage in restorative justice, keep changing and keep becoming. And it's what, you know, my friend Aisha, who's an atheist, who's going to interview me next week on the West Coast, like the closest she gets, her theology of this is life is very dynamic, you know, and that's true. Like life would be so boring if God was a puppet master and we were the puppets. Like where would be the fun of any of this? And it's the salty that brings out the sweetness in life as well. So I know that's really cliche, but it's cliche for a reason because it's true.
So I've worked in oncology as a social worker, and I'm hoping I get to go back into that very soon. One of the things that I find hard about working to support people going through cancer is that there is this fairly relentless culture of battling cancer and always fighting, and it to me is a lot of toxic positivity. So what advice would you have for someone who's professionally or personally walking someone through cancer where that frame is just not working for them and may in fact be harming them in some way?
Sure. So the question is, you know, it's specific to cancer. There's a lot of toxic positivity around coping with cancer, and how, if in that area, would you help someone for whom that's just not working and not helpful? But I think could apply more broadly for anyone for whom that's sort of pick
anyone
yourself
going
up
through
by your
something where they're like,
bootstraps, or
you can
it's
fight
all
this.
right.
Yeah.
It's all going to be okay in the end, kind of thing.
I think it's unique for every person, and I think they have to find their thing. And at first with my cancer, I was like, I'm going to use non-violent imagery, and it's going to be great. I'm just going to imagine the cancer like little bubbles, and we're just going to everyone blow the bubbles away with your prayers. And then I was like, fuck that, I'm going to fight this motherfucker, you know, like I needed to get into battle mode. Like it was hard on my body, and I needed to sort of draw on that chi, that like yang energy. I think everyone has to do what works for them, and you got to kind of like find your way into your own metaphor. I also had a friend who I love very dearly, one of my best friends from high school, who is super new agey, and like she sent me an email early on, and she's like, you know, whatever, when we didn't quite know what it was, we were pretty sure it was cancer, but it was in a weird place, and they couldn't figure out what kind of cancer. And she's like, whatever this is, you know, its real name is love. And I was like, nope. No, it's not. So it's like people, because of their own anxieties, are going to give you their metaphor, their frame, and then you'll know if it's wrong and be like, nope. And then you just kind of keep looking around for the right one that makes sense for you.
So hold space.
Yeah, like if you're close to someone who's in treatment, I know it feels really inadequate, but like most of the time they just really want you to be there and say, yeah, this really sucks. Mm-hmm. Like it doesn't feel like enough, but it is enough. The two best things that people close to me did for me in treatment was my sister-in-law, Tia Carmen. She knew I was going to have 14 cycles of chemo, so she found a box of 14 like pink sparkly cards. She lived in California and I was in Somerville. And she wrote me a card for every treatment cycle that I finished, and I put them up so like I could see like there is like a ritual, like a physical, okay, we're getting through this. And my friend Sue, who's just like a super wise one and would be here tonight except her father-in-law died this week. She was just so steady, you know, like emails, texts. When I was in the hospital at the Brigham Christmas week and I was so sick and I had no energy, she made me get up and walk every day, like with my IV pole up and down the hall. She like came through cross Boston traffic, Storrow Drive, to walk me for 45 minutes and like walk me back to life. So just that, it doesn't have to be like sexy and creative and exciting. It just has to be really consistent and really real and not trying to rush someone out of grief or feeling like crap. Just mirror and just be there for them. Any other questions?
I was going to add that there's a chapter in the book, Out of the Mouths of Babes. And my Luke is featured in there for
Her kid.
coming up to, well, you could tell that story in 2 seconds and then I'll tag on to it. But
Do you want me to tell the story?
yeah, sure.
Oh,
and then I'll tag on to
Luke
it.
came up to me at coffee hour and he said, Mom said,
He was 5.
he he said, "Mom said you have cancer." I have no.
Mom told me you're having a little bit of cancer.
And I said, "I can do something about that." So he did the PMC bike ride in Concord
With Molly's
Rafe,
Rafe.
and they raised money, and it made them both feel very empowered.
But I think Molly said at the time, she was like, that was helpful. Like a little bit of cancer.
little bit
Yes,
of
I am
cancer,
having
yeah.
a little bit, maybe more than a little bit, but I am having some cancer. I am having some cancer.
Bite size, snack size.
But I'm bringing it up because I think it ties into the piece of resilience and non-binaries and staying in the gray. I mean, I always say I'd rather spend my day with, I did today, a 7-year-old or a 14-year-old, which I did the other day, a 14-year-old who lost her mom and her arm in Ukraine. But you know what? They can hold the fact that more than one thing can be true. And they kind of live in the gray all the time. If you've seen a toddler have a tantrum, like they're having 6 emotions at the same time. And I think we lose the ability to do that as we get older, but then sometimes things happen to us that break us open and enable us to do that again. And that's holding those things that seem opposite, being a good person and having bad things happen to you, all those kind of just seemingly incompatible things. I think that's what Molly does so well. And it's another thread through the book.
So, no other questions? Oh,
Yeah, I just have one more question.
Yeah.
I love challenging Reverend Molly.
do it. I love it. Bring it.
I'm like, I wonder if I could stop her. So this one is kind of what I kind of go through right now. In your book and kind of what you shared, I do know that you really work hard to be forgiving and non-judgmental towards people that are often considered very heinous, like pedophiles and people who kill. I do know, people who have also counseled, when you forgive, you're doing yourself this great. How do you reconcile when you bring forgiveness and non-judgment to a person or a group that backfires on you? Does that maybe sometimes shake your faith in the path that you're walking?
So how do you kind of hold forgiveness and redemption, but maybe in a way that doesn't backfire on you, or when does it backfire on you? How do you make sense of what is forgiveness? What does it mean to forgive?
Can you say more about what backfiring might look like?
Well, so speaking from personal experience, sometimes I'm like, I'm going to turn over a new leaf. I'm not going to slap somebody down. I'm going to forgive them, love them, accept them for who they are. And then maybe 3 months later, they'll do the same thing. Boy, I was really stupid to put myself in that position.
Yeah, I see. Yeah. Okay, so if you forgive and then they do harm again, and then you feel like an idiot because you set yourself up for that, like Charlie Brown and Lucy in the football, right? So I just read, and you should all read, Rabbi Danya Rettenberg's On Repentance and Repair. I forget the subtitle, but it is such an excellent book. She's brilliant, she's funny, she's kind, she blurbed my book. One thing she talks about with a lot more grace than probably Christianity deserves is how Christianity has emphasized too much forgiveness over restorative justice, right? Like we're supposed to forgive. Jesus said we're supposed to forgive 7 times 70, even I can still do that multiplication 490 times, which is like setting yourself up to let an abusive person continue abusing you and to, wear you down. And I'm not going to give a sermon, I'm not going to offend Jesus in this moment, but she just has really, and this is I keep becoming as a Christian and as a person of faith, she really has kind of shifted something in the core of my being. I don't think we have to forgive. I think it's a good goal, Anne Lamott says not forgiving is like drinking rat poison and hoping the rat dies. At the same time, I feel like a lot of us try to think our way to forgiveness or fake our way to forgiveness without asking for amends, without setting healthy boundaries to prevent further harm to ourselves or other people. So she lays a lot of it out there, and ultimately I think our goal, if we've been hurt or harmed, is to get free any way we can. So if by forgiving the person who harmed us we can get free, great. It's more about us and our work than them and their work. If we can't forgive them, but we have to do our own work to get free. So, yeah.
Thought I had you there, but you knocked it out of the park.
Oh, thanks. So we wrap it up?
Yes, 8:01.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight, fans. Just as exciting as I thought it would be to see people from so many parts of my life here. So please hang around, and I'm signing books. And then some of us are going to go around the corner to Scotch and Hops for a little beverage if you want to join there.
Fun.